In this video we're going to examine the idea of variable scope and functions a little bit more closely. It's a really important concept and it can be really confusing, so we're going to start with an example. So here I've created a function called function1. I've defined it at the top of my code. In this case there's no parameters or nothing being passed into the function. And I've set the variable x to 8 and I'm printing out x is whatever is stored in the variable x. Then in my main routine I've got x equals 10. Print x is x, and then I call function1 and then we print out that same statement again. So if we look at that code and we think about what it might do, we need to think about what's going to happen with this variable x and the value that's stored in it. Let's step through the code line by line. To start with, we create our function and then we set, in this case, what's called a global variable, because it's in the global frame you can see here, x to 10. And if we print out what x is storing, then you can see x is equal to 10. That's what we'd expect. Now if we call this function, because remember when we had the function definition up the top, it doesn't actually do anything until we call it, so this line of code here will activate that function. And we've got function1 over here. And now x equals 8, you can see that that hasn't changed the value in this other x. So that can be really confusing when you first start using functions. You've got the same variable name, but they're actually different variables. One is part of the global frame, and one is local to that function. So in this case, x equals 8 is entirely different to this x that we have down here. So now, because we have x equals 8, what do you think is going to happen when we print out x is, and then this value x here? Because we're part of this function, it's going to use the local variable x rather than the global, and it will show x is equal to 8. Now we don't have a return value for this function, so once we complete the function we're going to go down to the next line, which is our final print statement, and you can see that function has now totally disappeared and those local variables have gone. So there's no reference to x being 8 anymore. We've still just got this x equals 10 as part of our global frame. So of course if we go forward, x will be equal to 10. So there's a simple example to show you how global versus local scope works. As I say, it can be really confusing, so it does take a bit of time to get used to, and it is a good idea to try and use different variable names within your function versus in your main routine to try and avoid this situation and this confusion. So just to recap what we went through in that example, there's a difference between individual functions and the main routine. So remember, the main routine is everything that's not part of a function. Variables that are created in the main routine are known as global variables, and they're available for the entire program. However, if you create them in the function themselves, they are local to that function. If you try and use a variable that was created inside the function, if you try and use it outside of the function, it'll crash your program because the name won't be recognized in the main routine. We can create global variables from within a function. It's a bad idea, it's poor programming practice, but if you absolutely have to, you can do it using this syntax that I've got in yellow. You just have the global keyword before the variable, and then you can use mynum in this case, and that would become available in the main routine as well as this function. Avoid it as much as possible. Ideally you will have no global variables. On the off chance you would need it, that is how you do it. In order to avoid using global variables, we use parameters and arguments and return values instead. So like in our first example in the previous video, we pass in some numbers to the function and then we return some values from it. I'd encourage you to experiment with these ideas, see what works and what doesn't. Have a look at the examples that I've listed in the learning plan document and read up on local versus global scope, because it is a really important concept.